Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. For thine is thy kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever, amen. For thine is thy kingdom, the power and the glory, amen.
Malo e Taumoepeau ba ko kore ke ufanga e ngai whatap ko toa be ko whaafaki me e Ngālu-ope. O tai rei ko toa ki motolu ke ki polokalama haafanga o e whiawhini. Ko e kaweinga o e whiawhini, o kia kuma wohi mai e ki kupu irea goeni, ko e Toloafi-he-Ope. O uhinga e Toloafi ko e hanebe ko haki totototu ko whenga ke kamata i hawhi. Pe ko hono Taholo e awhi, whai i he ope. O mau whakaukau ia i ki kau tau i te pire i he Fola-he-Ngalú, ko whakarea ia ke cyberbullying. Pe ko cyber abuse, ko kakai o ko Toloafi o whai i he Ngālu-ope. Ko hawhanga o e whiawhini, o ku iai e kau rea e tolu, toko tolu, Pea hiri anau ngahirea taktaha, pea whakatarewa ki ai ha ngai whehui. Mei he te motolo ku mea mai i he Zoom, kai o maa i he Facebooka. Ko e tau polokalama e mone rea na e whai e mrenai te ki mua, o tau rea ua i he pon, tau ngā wea ki rea whakatonga, pea mo rea whakabritania. Our three speakers, Taholo Kami will start us off. Taholo was a presenter at the previous session of Fola-he-Ngalú. He addressed issues related to climate change then, but this evening it's on cyberbullying, and Taholo will explain what he did. Hopefully he'll explain what he did for Tonga Online many years back. And we welcome Taholo. After Taholo will be Seini Taumoepeau. Seini is one of the young artists, activists, I shouldn't say young, one of the active artists here in Australia. She is a commentator, a critical thinker, almost everything. She showed up in our last session, and we have heard her, can I just say, yeah, I'll say it. We have heard from her sister previously, Latai, but Seini also goes by Sister Native. So welcome to Seini. And our third speaker, for Sāmiu Fonua. Sāmiu Fonua me Tonga. For Sāmiu ku kau background i technology, kau ki he poate o ku tokanga ki ngai mea whikau aki pia mo Ngālu-ope. Ako taitale rei ki mo tolu kotoa, mo whafofonga i atu e kau tau te pire, kau mau tolu o ku whanongo atu ki ho mo ngahi whamatalai whai, mo amanaki le rei ki mo tokoni e whai mai ki a te mau tolu, kau maa e mau whanau, o ku nau mo ui i he ātakai o Ngālu-ope. Ko he kai ki te whaloloa, ka ko oange ulak whai mamari e ki a Taholo. Inaka Taholo.
Malo sione and kole hufanga Good to see some familiar faces. Jason, been a while, and also Sāmiu, one of our ex-Suva brethren, but and I'm familiar with many of the names on here as well. But, just a quick introduction: Taholo Kami, based in Suva, currently consulting on various things. Also Setuata at the Tonga, working with our Tongan community here. But just to share a little bit on the topic today, cyberbullying. In 1994, I went on a scholarship to the US, and I was looking for rugby scores. Who won the Sydney Grand Final in Nashville, Tennessee? And at that time, I was studying business in Vanderbilt University. And I couldn't find any information until I went on the internet and found out who won. And it blew my mind because everything we'd been trying to do in Tonga with marketing and to bow young farmers and all these other things we've been trying to do, the internet promised connectivity like we could never imagine. So instead of studying, I started doing websites, and I started a site called Tonga Online. At that time, being the only Tongans in Nashville, at least that we knew at that time, we're always looking for other islanders. And I may have found Sione and them on the, what was the name of the email list, Sione?
Yeah, there was Kautailoa, it was at the beginning.
Yeah.
It became Tasilisili later.
So there was the Kautailoa email list. And at the same time, just trying to connect to people. And so I started a site called the Coverball Forum, from Nashville, Tennessee. And it became almost like, we're suddenly getting into 1 million hits a month type traffic, really early, and running it from my room in a little apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, and watching a lot of behaviors of just on the chat, on the message boards, because this was even before the Samoan sites. This would have been the first of the significant Pacific communication sites online, and this was 95 right up to 2000. And for all the magic of communications, the fact that you could get messages out with the websites trying to tell everybody about Tonga and putting out all the different things happening in Tonga online, these open chat sites was quite an experience. And then of course private chat as well. And in the early days, sort of thinking, how do you manage this behavior? At the same time, you're getting a glimpse into what do these communities look like, how Tongan communities look like all over the world as people were logging on, the issues they were discussing. And there was a time where, I'd wake up in the morning, and I'm running this all for free, or not free, off my credit card on the hosting, student credit card. And I'd wake up in the morning, and you'd have sometimes a few really positive, constructive discussions going on at the end. And then of course you'd have 40 or 50% of it was just junk. And suddenly these things would just happen where suddenly they'd pick on someone. And you saw things that started to come out in the early days, the late 90s, that have become a normal discussion today. They've given it terms like cyberbullying. I've seen harassment, where just on a line of information, people just taking on others. And then it becomes a huge issue, which all I'm trying to do is delete, kick people out of the forum and try to manage. Moving back, now we're in the Facebook age. I had one claim at one stage that I was the first Pacific Islander to get completely burnt out on the internet. I woke up one time in 2000. By then I was working for the UN, running developing their SIDSnet, or Small Islands Developing States Network. But on the side was my Coverball. But the Coverball was far, far busier than the Small Islands site that was being funded by the UN. But the Coverball was also the problem site. I woke up one morning, there must have been over 100 posts, many of them controversial and junk. And I just switched the whole thing off. And I didn't want to see anything online other than news or maybe 5 years after that. Just a complete burnout on this whole, what's the latest thing happening with communications on the internet. And but it was an interesting experience because much of what we see today, as long as people hide behind anonymous names, it gets ugly. And then as long as people can, and then as you think you're managing it, you've got a whole new generation with so many other tools, engaging in new conversations that don't have the eyes of their parents or other people in those spaces. And it gets, the ugliness starts to repeat over and over again. And then we only see the tip of the iceberg by the time it makes the media, or that by the time it becomes a big issue. And the reality of how do we deal with that in our societies, but even narrow that down in our Tongan society. And how does the church address this reality? How does the communities that we're in start to deal with this at a family level, then at a community level? I'll stop there, but looking forward to discussion.
Naka Taholo, we'll move over to Seini.
Kia toa everyone. When I was asked to attend this meeting and then speak on cyberbullying, I had to, of course, reflect on one thing was the space, that is the cyberspace, and then the other part of that would be the bullying aspect. So I wondered, what is it that I could arrive here and contribute to this space? My uncle Gione had mentioned that I also go by the name of Sister Native. And just from what Taholo was speaking about, I remember that when I moved out of my mother's home and went away to study, so I had to move to another city, I remained in the same state, but I moved away from home for the first time. That was in 1995. And there weren't a lot of Pacific Islanders where I went to study. But I was really, really glad to find just a few books in the library. One of those books was a book by a Hawaiian lawyer and educator called Haunani K. Trask. And that book was called From a Native Daughter. Reading that book, I decided I'm also a Native daughter. And so I named myself Sister Native, mostly because I needed to create an email address. The first email address I received was the one from my university, which a lot of people get. But because I'd heard of this space called the Govabo, I could only really access the internet at the time at university, but I couldn't log on to the Govabo with my university email because that wasn't allowed. So in order to talk to these Tongans all the way across the world, and because I'd heard about this this online space, I created myself what was then the most, I guess, the most user-friendly email space, which was Hotmail. So I became Sister Native at hotmail.com. I can't get emails there anymore, but I decided to retain the Sister Native part that I inherited from Haunani K. Trask ideologically in the library, at the university library, I guess. And I started to call myself Sister Native actually inside the Govabo space. Since then, I've had a 30-year-long career of being Sister Native on stages all around Australia and also around the world, but also as a broadcaster, starting in 1988 in my community radio station, where a lot of Tongans have found their voice all over the world. But I also, many years after that, in 2018, became an Australian voice inside that invisible space that is radio. So broadcasting to Southeast Asia and also to the islands, which I think was the most important part. Broadcasting to a footprint that spanned East Timor all the way across to, I think our outer island was the Cook Islands. So in 2018, I became conscious of my voice broadcasting to that level of space, that space being an invisible one. And so when I said to Gione, yes, I'll come and speak, I decided to frame my ideas around the concept of and the reason why is because as a creative person, I call myself an orator and songwoman. I'm often working only in the invisible, always in a conceptual space. So not just thoughts, but also anything that moves that we can't see. Right now, we're in a global pandemic, and I feel like a lot of people are becoming more and more aware of things like bacteria, or even indigenous genomes, or the idea that there is data and information inside what is now the information age, moving all the way across this world and even beyond into space. And these are some of the things that, as a broadcaster, especially on ABC, broadcasting to the Pacific, that I'd have to consider whenever I was creating my stories. So storytelling to the Pacific and an international audience in 2018 became, I guess, my greatest muscle to exercise. So having done that, in considering cyberbullying, one of the first things when working with creating a story is that we go and find out some facts. So I found out what it is. A cyberbully is someone who uses technology to harass, threaten, stalk, or embarrass another person. And so when I was reading that just a little bit earlier today, I looked at the part that is technology. Technology is the part that we think is visible because it arrives on our devices like our phones or our computers or our iPads. But really the way that these devices are talking to each other is just like how a light bulb talks or the way that a radio talks. The signals are sent invisibly. And so a lot of the stories that we had in communicating with the Pacific at that time was looking at things like this. What is the power behind this technology? What are the politics behind this technology? And then, of course, when we're making the stories, we're thinking about what about the everyday user and how are they thinking about that? So when I thought about what will I speak about when I was talking about cyberbullying, I looked at some of the facts. Some of them are 60% of teenagers experience cyberbullying. That's more than half. Another one is 45% of teenagers are online all of the time because they have cell phones in their pockets, mobile phones. This is very prevalent in our region, in the Pacific region. And then another one is 88% of teens say that they share too much information, too much personal information on the internet. And so I was just thinking about some of those facts. And what came to mind was actually an aunt of mine who's a musician. And she actually was the very first champion of a taulunga competition in Tonga in the 60s. Her name is Sayonara, or Nala, if any of you know her. And she was explaining to me the way that she likes to tune instruments. She called like her classical piano, she tunes that one, she calls it Valama'a. So that one's got Western classical tuning. Then she said she has another guitar. That one she tunes to sound like Samoan. And then she has another that's based on the way that Samoan tuning works. And then she has another guitar. That one is tuned to a Tongan tuning. And I found that one the most interesting. But she calls those two guitars in their tuning Valasi'i. And so as a Tongan person or a Tongan woman, when I think about keeping myself and my family and my community safe, I often go back home to my grandparents' homes. I have one in Kolomotua, my grandparents live there. And I also have one in Nukunuku in Hihifo in Tongatapu. And when I'm in those places, I feel very safe. Usually it's the job of other people to keep me safe. And when I think about cybersecurity for my family, my brother works in national cybersecurity here in Australia. So I feel relatively safe because he'll tell me when anything's going wrong. It's the same thing when we're at home, is that usually it's some people's job to keep our homestead safe. And so I decided to think about some of the behavioral patterns that we might attribute to keeping ourselves safe from cyberbullying or just cybersecurity generally. When you're a broadcaster, you often have to think about, number one, your own safety, your personal safety, and two, then the safety of whoever you're representing when you're speaking publicly. This is something that I feel like Tongan people know all about. And so I thought that it's a very interesting concept, taking my Auntie Nala's Valama'a and Valasi'i concept, and then applying that to how I might teach younger people to be a little bit more safe. Because I feel like that concept is something that every single Tongan can relate to. So for example, Valama'a, along with wearing those clothes comes a certain set of behaviors, and that perhaps even if you are on your phone all of the time, because 88% of teenagers say that they are also on the internet most of the time or all of the time, they need to decide if they're going to wear Valama'a or if they're going to wear Valasi'i and behave in that way, or in fact, be terefua in front of everybody. And that's something that I think is a way that you can take your phone or your device, be on the internet, and adjust your own behaviors accordingly. Another thing that I found out was that most of cyberbullying happens on social media sites. And so I thought that a really quick tip to share that I read, so I didn't make it up, was that inside these social media sites, there's options to report, block, or delete. And that if you just simply use one of these three things, you might be a little bit more safe from people who might attack you than if you didn't use those three things. Valama'a is always a good way to go when you're operating publicly. And so on that note, I'd like to end. Malo.
Malo Seini, modal fogel mo Valama'a, mau tolwek mau Valasi'i be mau. Mau kataki be mau ho Valasi'i mai ni. Sāmiu Fonua me Tonga I aha toko ni mai malo Sāmiu.
Malo sione, ko le peke u whanga te whakatapu, whawhewhia to e whanonga atu ki a Taholo, ka mo si atu e kinau tolu kua nau kunau. Join in mai e whiawhini. E sione whamaloa te mai whainga maari e. Nga le peko o kamatana e taimilahi foki e ku ngā aue I Fisi. And I had time ko ia around 10 years ago. We toki kamata ia ke struggle e Pasifiki ia he whinga e connectivity. Ai nei kai te fu ia ha whainga whakakau ia e koe haa koa e mea e hoko. E tau whanonga koe ni mo e whainga teknolosia koe ni. Ne lahi pe. Ai go Tonga ni foki ko tok tau pe ne fiha ai o neki mai ko ni ai whaipa pe mo e high speed internet ke ngawe ke Fonua. Ai au kei pehe pe foki mo ngai Fonua ko e Pasifiki o Solomon e nau kei whenga ke nau connecti mai ke high speed internet. A ko e ngai Fonua ko ni ko nau osi whakauwhiowhi atu nau tolu koi ki he ngahi mea kon ku hoko I New Zealand mo Aositelēlia mo ngai whanua koe, maha ko Fisi ka wea mo Haamoa. O ku ia ngahi challenge for all koe ni. Ai a ku kawai ai ne cyberbullying ai nu whaikia tana noa he koe. O e te ki whakamatara pe ngahi mea ko ku hoko I tongani he taime ni. Ngai tau koe ni e tolu pe wha koe ki muinina ia e campaign lahi au pito ia whaka Fonua pe. Wai pe ki kulupu ia I tongani o nau tokanga ki he cyber safety ma cyber security. E campaign ni koe he cyberbullying. E raise pe awareness I koe ai whanau pe mo e kakai e Fonua. Kana e tō e whamama wha ki he whanau ako. What's funny, as you've seen in the past years, I pick up he matua ngawe ke social media. You would find most of the issues around cyberbullying these days are mainly involved elderly people, particularly women. Abusive video feed and abusive chats and so forth, coming from all sort of places. And ki hoha ki ai Fonua mahana mo whanau beki ai about 2 years ago, whahinga abusive behavior ko iana alpeo a whalelahi. And I find ever if I go put Tonga ke na hanga o block mo a Facebook. And I will find ever if I no go time go ke se ago he poate Tonga ke polo. O fai tala no be mo lista la o aho ko ia. Pe lava o block au bit Facebook. O pa go ta no go na mau fai go he kai ke la vai o solo vai para mai e mau polo ka matola Tonga ni ka ngahi me go ni o fai e muri i ngai Fonua e muri o excess ko ke ai ka kai e fai ngata be ke block e ku pe o tuku ai pe kai fai e fa totolo holo pe ko hai fai e ngahi tau lau go ni o fai holo ko e internet. Hago toki weekend e tolu me ai na te whai mau ki talanoa kai mo kalafi mo e ki po kalama na whai kalafi. Tō kalahaka peke whakaukau sione ai fo o koe ni ai fo concept ko cyberspace i he kakai Tonga. Mo Pasifiki ipe. We're creating a new virtual space. It's not familiar with a lot of our people. All of a sudden, we're drawn into this high-speed access. It's getting cheaper now, and all you have is a little device that opens up the door to so many things that you can view on the space. Aia, koe foi mea kona aloha ke whakakaukau koe foi concept ko e cyberspace o teke fu Uesiliana ia ke Toloafi kakai. Te whido ta kakai ko ni Tonga ni. Te mo kakai Tonga pe una I muri. Ke na hanga whakatoka ngā ai ki fo I kehe koe I fo I physical space I kutau Oceana maheni pe mo ia. Mo taimi ko ke I loto ai he fo I virtual space. We can get how many identities of AI, more high of AI. Going a lot of the things in that space. We can they're not, claim to be who they are. They can be anybody else. Why if I kakai ni go now behavior go in a physical space. Kehe au pitoia mo nau behavior go nau I virtual space ia. Aia koe whakaukau e koe alhake koe ki au koe hae whahinga mea koe whai Fonua. Kato te whito ki hono ako I koe tamaiki ngahi ako nau aware koe foi space koe ni o ku alu peke toe lahi ange. Pe kai ke ha whainga boundaries ia e ne hanga o limit ai ngahi mea koe te nau whetau laki ai. Pe a neongo ai whenga ia koe ni koe ki ke whau e ngahi lao pe mo ngahi policies koe o whenga kia ngahi kautaha mo mea. O taimi lahi taimi koe te whetau laki ai kita pe mo virtual space koe mei foki mai peke a kita individual. Pe kuanga whewhe a hono malu I kita ai pe mo te respect ai kakai ke he ai. Kai foki te whaha lotu ia he cyberspace isi on. O kai foki aha whahinga principle of whewhe ia gene malu I ho me whai ai. Koe pe mo ki screen whatever happens out there nobody knows Aia koe foi challenge lahi taha ia, o ko siwa uia ki ai, pe koe e anga fe, e tau hanga o raise awareness ko ia ke whatonga e kaka ai. There is something called cyberspace. It's there. It's real somehow. Ka oku iai e ne kaunga ana ia I he foi physical space ko e ni but ne lava pe Uesia a ki tau tolu e foi physical space ko tau ia. Ko ki whakakau pe ia sione ko mau koe taimini he ko hi he ko mea na mau tok tala noani pe ki ai lahi koe ne hono o haki. Ai ngahi issue koe ni ki he no ngau e aki o e social media lahi. O ngani ko traffic lahi taha ia ko I tongani taimini. E tau traffic koe ki he K-polo. O e social media. Aia ko tui mahalo me me pehe ka tau pepe ngai Fonua. Tau mahino ai I've challenged koe e tau whinga ke raise awareness koe e kakai I he ngahi mea koe e tau kōwika ki nā tō. Tā whito ke cyberbullying. O ki ngata tuai rea tō kiaha whaingari. Malo.
Malo Sāmiu. O ko whangamarian ke tau ki hawhangai, mo tau ki ha mo whehu I pia mo ha mo comment o ko ki tāna ki mai, e ki nima mai bea ka mau awhi atu. Ka koe tā noa le rei ko whai, pa koe mahalo issue mahu inga ini ko whanongo ki ai mea te tau pia Seini pia mo Sāmiu, pia mo Taholo, notion of space. Ko mahino whakatau dolu ko space ko ia no whangatangata, ia boundaries. Ka pai ka ia boundaries, pa hangere bau ka space ia. Mau inga space. What does cyberspace mean? Now, Taholo?
Can I just add to the space thinking? Is that what was seen as cyberspace, it was easier to define maybe 5 years ago. And what you're seeing now is a real merge of all the media. And something comes out in the Sydney Morning Herald, it's out on Facebook. It's being reinterpreted, it's being requoted, and then suddenly all these other discussions come from it. And we're seeing, you know, the Fiji Sun here, which is a very dim thing of a media channel, but they put a front pager out on the minister that they don't like, who's just resigned. But suddenly the debate is not, the big debate is on cyberspace, all fueled by something that came on the front page of a lousy newspaper. And suddenly these interactions, you suddenly realize that even what's happening in our church, because someone can pull a camera up, suddenly that space becomes cyber too. Especially if something's said there that doesn't quite go with, or it goes with somebody's opinion. So this cyberspace thing is suddenly getting into where suddenly everything we're doing we've got to recognize how easy that becomes a cyberspace issue, where the discussion goes crazy. And yeah, so I'll just stop there as you're talking about space.
Malo Taholo, Caroline?
Malo Pito, especially to the presenter Seini, Taholo Mafokia, Sāmiu, Whape Whatapu, really enlightened with the conversation and dialogue from Seini in regards to Valama and Walasi. So it's always nice to join conversation and new dialogue like that, that we can, anything to help better a situation. So I was happy to hear that. I just wanted to comment, I suppose, on the discussion of space as well. And I think you know, we have to be mindful and not so naive that our generation and our children don't know enough about cyber, because this is their era. They created these new platforms. It's grown so big because of our children. They've created these different platforms. And if COVID has taught us anything apart from what the virus is and death, it's also taught us that, you know, we have also redefined what, you know, what physical space or physical presence is, because us here is, we now call that physical. We are physically present with each other. So there's new definitions of presence and being physical. And I think the biggest, you know, we can go on in so many ways of you know, discussion about cyberbullying and how we can prevent it and things that happen. It's becoming difficult because our children see their parents, see their aunties and uncles doing it online. And but we'll find out, you know, it's no longer a kid thing to do. It's an adult thing to call out someone physically and in any capacity, whether it's aggressive or whatever. Facebook, you know, so, and, you know, and that's the way we communicate now. We have to be reasonable. That's our communication waves now, that it's no longer, you know, Seini will probably be able to comment more about presentation and broadcasting, but, you know, there'll be very few broadcasting or news bodies that will just broadcast locally or be present physically. It's not enough anymore. You have to get on to the cyber, you have to get on social media, and people want the other people across the world to know about them. It's not just about being relevant in your own country or your own area. People actually want other people they have absolutely no idea of to talk about them, to hear them and see them. So thank you for this really important and great discussion today, facilitating Sione. So for me, it's just thank you. I don't really have a lot to contribute or anything important. It's just thank you.
Yeah, Malo, that's important. What you've said is important, and it's directed to Seini. But maybe if I can add something to that, Seini, before you offer your thoughts. It's not just space that cyber, that this technology has presented differently. It's also time. So space and time. You know, it's between here and New York is with a click you get to New York, but you in crossing over, time disappears. So is that something that you can think in those two frames, Seini, or maybe I'm asking? Feel free just to push back.
I'm just trying to understand, yeah, what the suggestion is in terms of time. Can you clarify just a little bit? Because I find it interesting.
Yeah. No, we can't think of space without thinking also of time, and we can't think of time without also thinking of space. And these are things that Ngalú-Ope, this technology, has kind of messed up from our usual way of thinking. You know, time in temporal, space in terms of physical. Now, space is fluid. Time is also fluid. But I want to bring in an element from the previous session. I think David had raised this. We can use this platform or whatever we call it for education. Yeah, so there's bullying is one side. There are benefits in here as well. Sorry, I'm kind of hijacking this conversation. I'll just drop that. Are there other concerns, Latai?
I was just thinking, thank you for all the presentations, really great discourse. I'm wondering about what existing cultural frameworks exist already that translate once people understand that cyberspace is public space, not personal space. And ideas are like Tauhiwa, these things is the observation of the space between us. It is virtual space, but it is also physical space across time. You know, so I'm wondering about how we might expand these kinds of cultural frameworks that talk about socio-relational space and how they might be implemented in the day-to-day because they already exist, and they're ideas that can be taught intergenerationally. And I guess there are still challenges around practices like, you know, Caroline was talking about, like things like ideas of being an influencer. You know, my nephew, he dreams of being a gamer on YouTube, you know, like what kind of, you know, these ideas, it is this space, young people's space, much younger than myself, but there are a lot of existing structures that I think that can influence how we might start to generate codes of behavior that have always worked and that can translate into the technological space.
Malo Latai, Sāmiu, I see a smile on your face. Do you want to have a go at joining that conversation?
Malo sione. Ogo interest pe fokia he tarano ko ki anga ko e tau fe pasi a ki holo i foi mani ko ni ku tau si anga maheni moia all the frameworks, cultural framework, legal framework, a whole lot of frameworks that were designed, you know, especially for controlling our behavior in our physical presence. Ko foi platform for all ko ne tau on my physical presence going to cyberspace. It's totally new. And how go for me go no for whakau ki ai go struggle ia he taimini foki go thing go get put some control into the cyberspace so that we can somehow relate we can easily relate the frameworks that we used to in our physical presence to our cyber presence. It's not easy, but it's something that worth exploring. And discussions like this will bring out a whole lot of ideas, especially for Tonga, of course, and some of our island countries. Struggle lahi kia aen go mawhatonga I he taimini I tonga ni. Ko e fo'ou ki he kakai ai fo I tau ataina ko all of a sudden you're given this freedom and you're not guided by any frameworks on cyberspace. And how you present yourself towards artists. It's up to you, you know, totally up to your own undertaking. You can be a nice person on our physical well, and you can be nasty, you know, when you step into the cyberspace. I bring out the for issue go, yeah, but you know, we are continually learning how we cope at a personal level in cyberspace. But also how we can develop the kind of frameworks that will define our existence there. You know, it can be, it may not be, you know, a specific cultural presence of, you know, say, us Tongans or Samoans, you know, it can be something, you know, it can be a totally safety culture or cyber security culture that we need to create. But those things, I'm still looking around for that, you know. Mau whetaka ko ni he taimini loto tokolahi I tongani ke whai mo filter I traffic on ko hau ki tongani. So we need to create some kind of censorship or filtering legislations. O kei lahi ngai mea e whai hono tala noai. But this is one of the platforms. What we're doing now is actually in a virtual world with physical presence. So it's nice. Mahalo.
Yeah, Taholo.
Yeah, it's just interesting. Just to add to that, you know, the mention of influences. And I've got a 23-year-old daughter and a 17-year-old daughter here. And they're right into this whole discussion. And, you know, I often listen in and sort of talk on this thing about who's the influencers amongst them. And one of them came to me and went, hey, I've been invited to speak at this session because I'm an influencer. And of course, being the father, I go, so who have you influenced at all? And then we talked about influences. And then she raises like, you know, this so-and-so in my class has now got 600,000 followers. And then I said, great. What did she do to this thing? And she goes, but she doesn't say anything that makes sense. I said, well, she's got 600,000 people who think she does. But here's the thing is, and then we talk about what are you influencing? And then, you know, coming back to this thing that, you know, I like listening to Samuela because he was a director at the gate at Tonga Cable. Yeah? Everything that came into Tonga. Of course, everyone wants to address the gateway, but the other side of it is, you know, what are the conversations we have with our children or grandchildren on these issues, and the challenge about what are you influencing? Because there's, you know, you could have someone with you know 10 million followers, but you know, what sort of society are they creating, and what are they contributing to it? Simply because they like shoes or they like a certain kind of food. And you know, this whole challenge about starting to say, what do we do with the community that we have, that they become influencers online or in whatever they're doing in a different way, and bring other people on board. Because as you're hinting at, Sione, as our neutral or non-neutral moderator, there are many wonderful things that the internet offers that we wouldn't have otherwise. And I've just come off another thing I was hosting where we had the Cardinal Mafi speaking to our Suva community, Tongan community. And I had to come off onto this one. But again, starting to say, our challenge here in Suva is saying, with this lockdown and with the COVID experience, how do we create a group of leaders who go back to Tonga someday and they can make change happen? And how do we start to do this with these networks that we're on and shape influence? Anyway, let me stop there.
Malo Taholo, our time is escaping us, and so is our space. But I'll ask this question for the three of you, right? And for you to also kind of give your final remarks. In our last session, one of the challenges that was posed is that we have responsibility. We have responsibility to what in the last session to the internet generation. And it's obvious now that the internet generation in Tonga are the oldies and not just the children. So what is our responsibility to our internet generation, in your opinion? And I want to add to that what Seini had referred to. Cyberspace, we talk about God as the Taiha Mai. the non-present, or at least not the physical in appearance. But cyberspace is where reality does not, but we created it. So how do we create it responsibly? And that goes back to what Taholo was saying about his daughter being an influencer. So how do we influence in ways that we create the Taihamai and have responsibility for this internet generation that includes oldies as well as our children. Seini, you wanna? Okay, I'm not just a moderator, I'm a hijacker, so I hijack things. So feel free to push back, Seini, but please get us going here, or wherever you wanna go.
Awesome. So what is our responsibility? Thank you for picking up on the Taihamai part, and also what are our responsibilities as we create it. So the very first thing that I thought was less about creating, more about relating. And that is to recognize that while cyberspace itself is new, it's a little bit like any other technology where power is involved. We're in that when you have power to use it, it doesn't change you necessarily. And this is some stuff that just comes from media backgrounds where the user of the media also influences the person itself. But it does highlight what our values are and changing values, especially the climate of capitalism and the way that it influences the way that we use this particular technology. But also as Tongans, for me, it's more about where do we position ourselves? And I literally just think of a bird in the sky or a fish in the sea or a boat on a horizon, in that it's mostly about the direction and then also how you're relating to the things in your immediate vicinity. I think about things like, for example, the initial, if cyberspace were the ocean, then how can we use things like, for example, me'etupaki, something like that, that helps us position ourselves physically. So then we'll talk to this element, talk to that element, and then we'll make decisions. For me, it's mostly about navigational principles inside an intersectional reality, and then to be clear on the values that you express, whether you're the person creating the framework or whether you're the person using the technology. And I always look through the lens of hohoko, being that when I look at my ancestors, all of them being Tongan, my grandparents, for example, I think back to how they use their technologies and then what were the navigating principles. And then I just literally cut and paste that, Control-C, Control-V. And then I know, even though the parameters are different, I am still being the person I'm on the planet to be. And it's something that I encourage, like whether it's clients or even audience, to do, to use your hohoko and everything that it gives you first and foremost to determine what your relations are and then what your values are in any space, whether it be cyberspace or any space, physical space, thought space, intellectual space, voice space. Yeah, that's where I'm positioning. Mahalo, thank you.
Mahalo Seini, Sāmiu, pada untuk faos ke Taholo kadaki.
Malo sione. Mahau ki a uia ko o tui pe uia o to tonu ke toiki tokoni ngai siasi. I anga koe tau nofo ke community Pasifiki ke fu influence lahi ngai siasi ngai mea lahi. Ka ku hange ko ki silent ngai siasi he talanoa ke tai ha mai ko ni. O tui pe ko mea ia taha ton ke tokanga ki ai ngai siasi. Na ege mai kalafi ki au peku. Peku fefe ka fai fe ka au anga kono teu ki na tolu he taimini e fe taulaki pe mo cyberspace. Pe talange pe o pai ke fai ha fai nga teu ki ai to na to ka mo na tolu ia e hu holo he cyberspace. Ka to ton pe ke nga issue lahi pa mani na tau tokanga ki ai Siasi hange ko taime ATC go taime go ne hange go talano he climate change go talano go ne cyberbullying go tui pe go mai issue lele ia ku tokanga ngai pule anga ki ai go ton ke kau mo ngai Siasi e tokanga ki ai o ia pesi ane ma
Malo miu Taholo ya o pama popo mai dau dolo bon.
Malo, Siani. Again, just on the, I'm not sure if we apply Taiha Mai to cyberspace. I think we saw this happening in the cover bowl in the 90s. And what happens when we become anonymous, and what happens when you can't have discussions at home or amongst your church community or others, and then you start to find solace in someone else's space, in another space. And the importance of starting to embrace or recognize how does a church community or Tongan community start to actively participate in a positive way. And much of that is not just the rules online, but also the rules offline, that we're consistent with it. I often find with my wife, with all our best intentions on control of how we use these things at home, with our daughters, I think as often they'd catch us holding that thing, the phone in between, because it's busy when you're a Tongan on Facebook. And that we just have to learn to deal with it and not think that technology is a solution. It's not Taiha Mai in this case. We actually know where this is going and what's happening to our communities with it. The answer is somewhere here and here. And I think it's sorting it out at the family level, sorting it out at the church level, embracing it in our community. And how do we utilize the positive side of influence rather than just continually respond or react to the negative? And so much of that, again, starts from the people around us and how we deal with it. But so happy to see all of you. Yeah, and in spite of this, technology lets us have these conversations. Malo, Sione.
Malo, so to an extent, Taholo, there's still hope, eh? Ka mea ke tau ngā ue ki ai, ka pau lawa tau hiwa kone for tu mai Seini, a mai ngai Siasi o tuku ai whakapaipa kai o mai o whai ha mea aonga ke o tau kakai malo pe topon. Caroline, you have the final word tonight.
I'm really sorry, Sione. I just wanted to ask a really quick question, I guess, Seini, because what I'm getting from Taiha Mai, these two views that I'm getting, and so I just want to clear up, Seini Kataki, is, because Taiha Mai, we've already conflated that term to be known, commonly known as God, yeah? But in the concept of our discussion, is this more of an etiquette that of our behavior in a translation of respect to the unknown, rather than to the godly entity here? So I just wanted some clarification so I could get my head around that term.
Indeed, far be it for me to be the expert on Tongan translation. For me, the mat on which I stood when I was making that offering initially, before the discussion occurred, was more rooted in the fact that I was suggesting that more from an Indigenous science perspective, so that which is the unseen. And of course, in this space that has its own definition, given who is present. But in terms of where I was going with that is that to me, that is the closest solution I can find to ideas about genomes, all of the things that are not declared to the eye itself, things that are not visible, the unseen. And in spaces like cyberspace or even in medicine or science, quite often to me that helps me navigate the next things, because after that then comes kere, and then after that then comes people. And for me, just having a prioritization order helps to navigate and make decisions. So that's where my offering of that initially was. Of course, everything else that followed. Malo, thank you.
Malo Seini, o whātu.
Ia, malo abito fa malo la hea fa fonga e te ka tawi te bire fa malo ke Taholo ka ma Seini ma Sāmiu. Pe ko anga maheni agi behe ki whadongiani o mo foto mai ngahi mea lahi ke hoko at ke e taranua. Ka ko kora Sāmiu ke taranga kalafi ke teu mua ke tariha mau kore atu ki ai. Kai ke toki ilone au i Tonga ko peha ko tamsinu sila. Kai talat veho mau ofa ki ai. Ka ko tui beke, o ton beke tau toi foki mai. Tau toi foki mai beho o hoko atu e talanoa. Ko hipe ko whakaukau e aonga. Whamalo lahi atu, ko mea kon ke tai ha mai, mo katak whamore more bea kau ki hijacki mai tai ha mai. Ko ohi ko motua Uesiliana o. Kapau te mo tol koe Uesiliana, te mo kapau te ia mo whainga maari ke sio ke tau konistu tone. O whawhai ke heke e ai o mea e ua. Ko tai ha mai o hingai ke otua, ai ko blau koe ki a Caroline. Te mo Siasi ha mai. Ai ko ngo foi differentiation mau inga ia. Ka te mau tolu koe mātua mo whini mātua Uesiliana. Kau kai foko kai ko forum ni a Uesiliana. Neongo tau heka behe waka o e Siasi. Ko whawhi at mo tolu ki he September a uluaki. Ko tau session ai i he o koe o tokanga ki he taona kita. Ko e rea ai ko Valencia sin Sāmiu Aotelēlia, ko e rewa kau tui talanoa, ko Aminia Skefu, ko kui Aotelēlia daimin, ko manu foto kui Aotelēlia, ya mo tau alofa anga ai langi. Anga tau ko tau alofa, kui lopo ko hapai po ko baba, o kui lotonga iai he taimini, o ku tau mo toi mea mai, ta tau vek mo tol kone i he Zoom, ya mo Facebook a. Pamalo lahi atu, pamalo ke penolo mo tol malo mo kata ki ai ku whakatupu ita ko whai, ya ko kia te au io kata ku whamormore kai whakaos yak pen. Ko mea kon rotonga hoko i Afghanistan e ahoni e ua me ia e huma e Taliban. Na e tokoni lahi au bito e cyber energy, artificial intelligence. This is the big god of this communication world, media. Ki hono predict e mea e hoko. Na whakaukau a Amerika, mahina tol, mahina ono, pa tok toa Kabul. Tō bei he within 10 days. Aya koe aonga koe o artificial intelligence, ke ne hanga o mai a information ka te tau tolu, o ku hauia he revola kehe, koe revola koe tau experience a tau tolu ia ku kehe ia. Tau ton pe ke tau wako, ke negotiate these different spaces in which we operate. Pea koe mbo kata ki pe koe motua palasi pe au ia, ka koe anga ia mahino ki hoku ata mai whakawalasi i, ai fuu, ngā ke whairea koe vanu, ai fuu vanu koe ni fuu space koe o internet, o cyberspace. Tau whamalo lahi atu ho mou tokoni mai ki tawhaki koe ni, cyberbullying. Ka mahalo beg ton ke tau te whoki ki a whawhai mā kalafi, ko malo nien i cyber security. E mea ke tau tokanga ki ai i e kāu. Kago whadawang ke mo mao ha malolo le re pon mo tolu e Facebook a ke pehe foki ke te tau tolu kon i Zoom. O whalahi atu, tawang ke mo mao ha po le re i tau te sio i e ka. Malo avito Taholo, Seini, Miu.
Malo apido sione.
Yo, mo kata ki beu ka ha box ai Fola-he-Ngalú. Ka mo to ki tagtahawat be ko mo ngai abi o mawa hai buai mafana ai malo.